I'm a bit nervous because Harsha asked me to come and share some jokes, the theme of which was supposed to be austerity, and and I looked over a lot of my jokes and couldn't really find that theme coming up. So what I've decided to do is take a lot of my jokes that people seem to love, and I've cut out all the punchlines. There's going to be a private show after this event. The tickets cost $9,000, but it's on a party boat. It's actually on one of the abandoned Coast Guard boats. When Europeans first came here, we described them as explorers. And explorer is a word that makes it seem like those first Europeans came here and that they were just looking around, right? Coincidentally, just looking around is what I would say when I was in high school inside of a CD store about to steal stuff.
The topic of tonight is something that has profoundly affected all of us in so many different ways. Like I was looking at the dictionary definition of austerity, because sometimes when I'm looking for ideas or different perspectives of things, I like to look at the dictionary and look at the thesaurus and look at the synonyms and antonyms, because I love words. And so it's a time of reduced spending, generally enacted by the government. But where is this reduction happening? Is it happening at the higher levels of government? Is it happening in every area of the city and to all of the different classes and genders and nationalities and backgrounds? No, because of what in another way could be austerity. My Musqueam people have lost out on so much in this city that is born onto our land without our permission, without our consultation.
But really, austerity does affect all of us, right? Cuts to women's centers, cuts to healthcare, cuts to education, cuts to all of the social programs, cuts to housing subsidies. These are all austerity. And what we see happening with public spending is that it's going into things like prisons, the military, security defense forces, and corporate bailouts and bank bailouts. And so austerity does affect all of us, though of course it affects all of us differently. We're not all equally impacted by austerity. We're not equally impacted by the systems of capitalism or oppression or colonialism. So what this event attempts to do is attempt to be attentive to the specific ways in which austerity impacts different communities differently, while still imagining what it would mean like to build solidarities across those differences, right? So being attuned to differences while building a unified movement.
Some of you might remember this story about this whistleblower from a few years ago. So she revealed that EI investigators had targets for the number of people that they needed to kick off of EI. And I wanted to mention a bit more details about this story because I think it's really where the logic of austerity meets the logic of neoliberalism. So it's not just this passive thing of money not trickling down, it's actually an active thing of kicking people down to the bottom of the pyramid and then creating a political economy around managing them, in particular a political economy that's favorable to certain political parties. So that's what connects things like this approach to EI that they had with private detention centers for refugees, with the temporary foreign worker program, different minimum wages for people of color, to what's happening in our prison system, where crime is at an all-time low, but the prison population is at an all-time high. It's increasingly made up of people of color and Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women, whose rate of incarceration has increased by 80%. I wanted to bring that in tonight because while we're watching Baltimore, I think it's important to also remember what's happening here. So this is neoliberalism. It's part of how racism and colonialism manifest in our economy, and austerity is part of how it's happening in practice. So what is the justification for this? Well, you can't understand austerity without understanding debt. And you can't understand debt without understanding the moral imagination about debt. So what we're being told is right and wrong in regards to debt. So when those cuts to spending started in the 90s, the story that the Liberals told was that the federal government was in way too much debt and that they were in the wrong. And in particular, that debt servicing was a huge problem. So what this graph shows is how much of the government's money coming in each year was being spent just to pay the interest on the debt, so not to lower the total amount of debt, just to pay the interest. So you can see here that in the early 90s, of every dollar the government received in revenue, it spent over 30 cents just to pay interest on debt. So in my lifetime, just since 1981, we've actually spent over $1 trillion on debt servicing.
When we talk about austerity, we often think about shrinking budgets. But actually, I think what's more important to consider is that what we're being asked to do is to shrink our hearts as a society. We're being asked to place stricter limitations on the boundaries of our compassion and how far we're willing to let that extend. So when these budgets get cut, if we want to look to where those impacts are happening, we need to only look to those physical boundaries, to those borders, and specifically past those borders. So we have in the last 10 years, as austerity has been rising in Europe, there's also been the rise of their border control program, which is commonly known as Fortress Europe. And we have a crisis that I'm sure many of you have seen unfolding over years, but especially in the past few weeks, of thousands of people drowning, attempting to go from their homes in the last few weeks in Syria and Libya and Eritrea to find a better life. And these are people who are just coming to hope to participate in what we have here, and we're being told we don't have anything. And we know that that's not true. And we're seeing that happen here, perhaps not as dramatically as the drownings we're seeing in Europe, but we are experiencing one of the largest mass deportations in our history. And a lot of this has been allowed to pass because of the racist reaction to the temporary foreign workers in the past year. So I don't know if a lot of you remember this, but that was largely targeted at Filipino workers in the fast food industry. And again, it was the words. It was a particular word that was used to really facilitate these deportations, which is all of these folks were described as immigrants stealing jobs. Stealing, right? So that word makes us imagine that, oh, these are criminals. When the fact of the matter is, if we're looking at the temporary foreign worker program, these are people who are here legally. They're not criminals. And I've thought about it quite a bit. I don't think it's actually physically possible to steal a job. Like, at most, you might be able to get in there and like work that job for like 20 minutes, but then they're gonna kick you out. So to be able to get in there and hold it down like 9 to 5 for at least 2 weeks, and then somehow convince the manager to put you on the payroll, it's very logistically complicated.
In Europe, the front line against austerity are trade unions. In particular, in Spain, the CGT has led a series of countrywide strikes repeatedly against the austerity measures, and it's other similar unions across Europe that are kind of leading that movement. But this brings up another point. There is no one labor movement, just as there's no kind of one labor union taking this on. And so I can't really talk about what the labor movement's doing. I can talk about what factions are doing. And that goes back to how the labor movement acts here in BC as well. But in Europe, labor unions are tied to political parties, so or to no party at all. And so a particular labor union might, in fact, stand its people down from fighting austerity because their political party has sided with an austerity measure. And so in Spain, the Socialist Union, the UGT, and the Communist Union, the CCOO, have both supported the austerity measures because their respective political parties, the PCE and the PSOE, both support the Conservative PP government. And so you see this a lot, right? But in BC, you see this too. Because when we talk about austerity, one of the things we're talking about really is the de-skilling of labor and also workers being pitted against each other to lower standards. And so in British Columbia, this was happening quite a bit in the late 19th and early 20th century. And one of the biggest ways it was done was through racism. And so we saw the exploitation of migrant workers, basically a lot of Chinese workers actually, and First Nations workers. And so the response to the labor movement was very different. On one hand, you had some of the trade unions came out and actually campaigned on no foreigners allowed and had racist marches and demonstrations. But then you had other labor unions that went out and aggressively organized migrant workers, aggressively organized First Nations workers, especially here on the docks in Vancouver. There was an entire First Nations local of the IWW, and aggressively empowered those groups through those union structures to be able to fight for their own rights, right? So they're not handing something down to them, but basically unions are creating a democratic structure under which people can express themselves. And for me, that is at the kernel of fighting austerity. It's creating democratic structures in which people can carve out a bit of economic democracy.
What Canada's strategy or pseudo-strategy to bring women from the global south to do caregiving, nannying, and all different healthcare aid positions in Canada. And really, it's in the absence of genuine strategies for childcare, universal childcare, and healthcare for the elderly and differently abled. So the LCP is an atrocious program that violates human rights and exploits women. We condemn it as modern slavery, as racist, unjust, and as anti-woman. But this fits well into Canada's, capitalist Canada's neoliberal globalization plan, right? It's essentially the privatization of healthcare for the upper and middle class. Because it's catering to the upper and middle class, it means that there are no solutions being made for the working class when it comes to universal healthcare. So that's where we're missing out. So essentially, the existence of the LCP stands as a barrier to all of the things that we are entitled to. In terms of social services, healthcare, childcare. But the thing is, Canada wouldn't continue this program unless it was functional, unless it was beneficial and profitable. To remain competitive globally and to sustain low wages, they need a surplus of low-wage workers, right? And what we find is that the Filipino community is overwhelmingly represented, actually recruited and streamlined because of the economic devastation that they have in their own country. There's brain drain in their home countries, and they come here and they're completely de-skilled. They come in as some of the highest educated immigrants, and they're basically confined to low service sector jobs. So this temporariness, this exploitation and criminalization, as we've seen with the 4 in, 4 out rule, is something that we continue to condemn.
The nature of our work is living and working in our employer's home. And we are so vulnerable. Very vulnerable, doing the dirty, difficult, and dangerous job. I said dirty because of the political system. Dangerous because we don't know whether we finish our 24 months in order for us to apply for our open visa. It's dangerous also because if we not finish our 24 months within 2 years, we'll be deported.
So that austerity narrative is basically, as you know, a well-resourced propaganda campaign designed to perpetuate the fiction that public services, universal programs for the common good, are just completely unaffordable for ourselves, and that the economic pie is shrinking due to these disembodied market forces, or as Riley described, debt and all these other, the stick that credit agencies hold, etc. And this narrative is then, again, as previous speakers have described so eloquently, is used to create vulnerability, such as poverty, financial insecurity, and all the attendant ills and stresses that go with that for families and for children who live it. As we've heard, creating vulnerability and a climate of fear for the future, whether you're a university grad or low income for whatever reason, is then used to create those divisions, again, that have been described so eloquently, between generations, between different groups of workers, between social service agencies who are forced to compete for money to do their good work, for funding, between the culturally defined deserving and undeserving. Do we give to addicts? No, they're not deserving. How about poor moms who made bad choices? All of those definitions that are out there that divide us. And again, we're told there's only one pie, and if we're going to give to these guys, we're going to have to take from these people. And this narrative never encourages us to talk about abundance, about the bigger pie, and especially a bigger tax pie. Vulnerability is created through austerity policies that drive down wages, shred the social safety net, and we've heard again, gutting the employment insurance benefits and program, frozen welfare rates for decades, and then shifting funding for public service, so those common good services, from individuals. So we cut corporate tax and we say, you pay for your MSP, you pay for your post-secondary, you pay for your counseling service and your child care. It's all a commodity, just buy it. So the impacts on children and families of this vulnerability, this created vulnerability, are very direct and long-lasting. Vulnerability undermines the health of families and, of course, their children. It increases their need for social services and public goods, which there increasingly are fewer of, so they're not there for them when they need them. And then, those vulnerable families and children are blamed for their need, for their poverty, for their ill health, and this is the really toxic narrative of austerity for families.
Indigenous peoples of North America have been dealing with austerity for a very, very long time, for many centuries. And of course, when the colonizers first arrived, like the young man said, they looked around and first thing they did was shut down our immigration centers and whatnot, and told us they were totally inefficient. And they looked around paradise and basically told us that we were completely mismanaging North America, and that if they could bring in a few of their friends and relatives, that they could change things for the better. And they've been here for several hundred years, and things are getting progressively worse. I think we all have an intuitive sense of what austerity represents in terms of privatization and deregulation, the omnibus legislation, the political repression, oppression of particularly the Harper government and the Clark government too, in that trend. And we all witness in our daily lives the devastating impacts it has on society in general, particularly women, Indigenous peoples, immigrants, those that are the most vulnerable to that type of repression and oppression. And I think as time goes on and we witness the undeniable impacts of global warming and climate change, and watch the droughts that are becoming the norm around the globe, and particularly in the U.S. and California and the Southwest. And we know that this didn't happen as a matter of happenstance. It's very much part of this, the capitalist poison pill, so to speak. And I think we also know in our heart of hearts that there is a duty and an obligation within all of us as human beings, as friends and neighbors, as people, to come together and share our knowledge, our gifts, our energies, and begin to organize and do something about it.